Hello and welcome to today's episode of the On the Up podcast brought to you from Moneypenny. I'm your host, Dan Marshall, and today I'm joined by Peter Knight. Peter, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Peter is an experienced business leader, speaker and author, works across lots of different industries, but most notably known for Property Academy. And Peter's here today to join us to talk all about leadership. Peter, it's great to have you here. I wondered if you want to start off with giving yourself a little intro.
Well, it's very kind, and thank you for having me. As my mother taught me to say in all these circumstances, it's great to be here. So my business is principally actually about leadership. Our purpose is to actually inspire people to fulfill their potential, which I think is a big part of leadership, and maybe we'll get into that. So I'm really pleased to share some ideas and some of the things we've picked up along the way.
Amazing. So I thought if we're going to talk about leadership, the best place to start is to actually define what we mean by leadership, because it can mean lots of different things to different people.
Yeah, it's one of those, whatever, I fear that whatever my answer will be, there'll be people saying, I disagree with that, and that's fine, isn't it? I think the one common factor, somebody, I don't know who, but somebody once said about leadership is the one thing that all leaders have is followers. And therefore my thinking is that leadership is really about attracting followers, but attracting people who wish to align themselves with the leader to a common cause. And that could be quite a lofty cause, it could be something that's profoundly important to society, or at the other end of the scale, it could simply be a commercial cause, and not for me or anybody else to judge which is appropriate. I just think that what a leader does is attract followers. Mm-hmm. Principally.
Yeah, that's really good. I've never thought about it like that before. You kind of sometimes think in more transactional terms of what a leader is, but at a high level, there's quite a broad remit of what they could be doing there. So that's really interesting. And then if attracting people is the main goal, what do you see as the qualities in a leader that allow them to do that?
Again, I think there's many different ways that one can lead, and there are many examples of different styles of leadership. But I'll defer to that Jim Collins idea about this category 5 leadership, as he calls it. And for me, I think the key trait of highly effective leadership is a combination of hunger or appetite and humility. And my sense is that what a leader has is this continuous hunger to do better, to grow, to make the difference, but balancing that with a humility where they never actually believe that they're more important than anybody else, or that they have somehow, that they are the key aspects to a business or an organisation. And I think the trouble, Dan, for so many companies is that I think with startups, a leader starts typically with a hunger and an appetite, and also will be relatively humble because they haven't achieved anything yet. But as the pathway continues and they get more successful, often the appetite diminishes a bit, and sometimes a lot, because they're successful, they're making money, they've achieved certain things, whatever. But also, unfortunately, so too the humility. They start to believe, oh, well, I am important, and they get treated in such a way that maybe makes them feel that way. So I think a key factor and a key trait to leadership is to maintain that balance of hunger and humility. And it's easy said, it's really quite hard to do.
Yeah, no, and they're interesting. I have a couple of questions around those skills as well, because they're interesting concepts in a way. And the first one is, do you think that they're just innate abilities or innate desires, or do you think they're things that can be trained and developed over time?
Well, running a leadership development business, clearly I am slightly biased in the belief that people can be trained. This whole sort of, is it nature or nurture? I'm very much in the nurture camp. And so I do believe that these skills can be, or these traits can be acquired if they're not already there. I think they're inherently there to begin with, though. And therefore it's about actually ensuring that the other stuff doesn't come in and overtake them. So it's maintaining that. And there are certain examples of certain individuals who, if you like, I think have demonstrated that they keep that appetite. The flame is still strong to do that. And if they can combine that with absolute humility and not allow themselves to be elevated or people say, oh, it's the team, when actually they mean it's them, and it's when they truly actually mean it. And one of the things that Jim Collins wrote about in that Good to Great book, but one of the great things about that was he said that the best businesses tended to be run by quite anonymous leaders, and the big sort of high profile personalities perhaps weren't as effective in the longer run. They may be there for a brief period. And I think he talked about the enduring legacy of businesses where they survive leadership changes. And a leader that leaves and a business that continues to grow and to fulfill its potential and to deliver on its purpose, I think that really is a mark of a hungry and humble leader.
Yeah, I guess as well, that kind of not a great thing for the leaders, but it's almost like once they've left, what they've left behind really then highlights how great a leader they were if the business is still growing, if people are still doing well.
I think so, and I think there's also that potential. What is the influencing factor? What else is spurned out of it? In my very early career, I worked for Barratt, the house builder, and I look back now at my sort of quite early stages of my career and the team that I was working with, and we were all young bunch of people, we were early 20s and whatever, and of them, 8, 9, maybe 10 of them have gone on to do some really quite impressive things, either within that organisation or other organisations. And I look back at that class, as it were, that we had, whatever the year was, class of 82 or whatever, and look back on it and think, and then actually that's a legacy that Barratt had, was that they nurtured, that group of people to not only be delivering for that organisation all the while we were employed there, but to subsequently go on. And I remain really grateful actually for that very early stage of my career to have been in an environment that fostered and nurtured that. And I've sought to take that with me.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because it's something I've often thought about. So a background of working in marketing, and I know of a marketing agency that was out of Warrington, very successful like 20 years ago now. But actually, there's probably 10 or 15 agencies now where the MDs, founders, CEOs all worked at that agency at the same time. So the same had that kind of legacy. And it's also connected to me. I was going to come to humility as well, but I think of, you see this kind of social term sometimes where people talk about the PayPal mafia, where obviously you've got Elon Musk's gone off with Tesla, etc. I think it was the guy that founded LinkedIn was involved, and so many other businesses as well were at that time. But they do have these legacies of like great people coming together. There's probably a great leader at that point at that business that's then instilled the leadership values onto people for the future as well, I imagine. So
yeah, I mean, I don't know Elon Musk's organizations that well, although I took a study group to the States a few years ago and we visited the headquarters of Google, Facebook, Airbnb and Tesla. And there were some super smart people there. I mean, that was the thing that really struck me, was that, he really, birds of a feather, right? He really did manage to attract, back to this idea of a leader having followers and attracting people, and ideally the right people to an organization. Some super, super smart people. And one of the big lessons from that, which still I think is really relevant in today's world, I remember this chap saying, he said, the thing is, because I was actually interested in their design and creative process. I thought, I bet there's a process to it. It doesn't happen randomly. What is their methodology for development and improvement? And I remember him saying, the thing is, he said, we're having to design products based on our belief of other organizations' developments of technology. Because if we wait to see what they produce, by the time then we activate our own development and production, it will be redundant. And I thought, what an incredible leap of faith to actually be designing and committing to products and services in advance of actually the landscape, in the belief that others will be doing things to enable that to happen. I think, with Elon Musk, I don't think anyone would describe him as a humble individual. But so it's not to say it has to be.
Yeah.
I just think personally, I think that when I look at people I work with, most of whom no one's ever heard of, but if I look at the business leaders that I work with, typically running small and medium-sized companies, they tend to have that. The best ones tend to have that blend.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because that's the first thing I thought of when you said humility is that kind of, there's almost like a celebrity business leader in a way, isn't there? That you look at the Elon Musk's, Jeff Bezos type people of the world who really exude hunger and appetite, but probably depend on how you want to argue it. Some people might not say they seem to have much humility, but they also, and Elon Musk's a perfect example, your point about a leader has to have followers. Like you say, like people really do buy into that and follow him, whether it's people working there or even just consumers as well, right? So
Yeah.
they've definitely got something maybe lacking on humility a little bit, but
Well, I think that's what that can happen as organisations grow and get and become more successful, and it's that almost they become to varying degrees almost arrogant, unfortunately, and not only do they exhibit therefore unpalatable or even just unattractive personal characteristics, it's that almost that arrogance of we know better than the customer. We know better than what the research we know what to do. Whereas I think when people start out, they often adopt a position of we don't know.
yeah.
And it's how do you retain that? And it's not easy, by the way, because you're being feted all the time. You build a business. Take your business, take Moneypenny, right? You build a business like this from very, very humble beginnings to what it is today as an organisation, its size and scale and international position and so on. It must be really hard for everybody associated with not to have a sense of pride,
Yeah.
and a sense of achievement and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that, so long as there's a retention of, but hang on a second, guys, there's still plenty for us to do here. We haven't cracked it yet, and what's more, there are a lot of new challenges on the horizon, and we've got to retain that sort of humble positioning, I think,
Yeah, I guess
to enable
it's maintaining your core values, isn't it? That even if a business goes from 2 members of staff to 2,000, it's like, how do you retain some of that?
Yes.
And it's part of what drives growth as well, I think, isn't it? Kind of some of the stuff you're talking about there is like kind of being uncomfortable with not knowing what's going to happen and being open to that as well really helps to fuel growth, I think. And where do you see the kind of leader's role within that growth sort of journey as well then? Because obviously you mentioned like Moneypenny as an example of where we have gone from a couple of people to 1,000 people and massive offices and global kind of expansion. It's very different to where you first started to where you are now. And for businesses at all sizes of their journey, startups right through to big corporates, they've gone through that journey, haven't they? So how does the leader lead in that growth journey?
Okay, I'm going to use a model of small, medium, and large. And what I mean by that is, I think there is a big picture, the large, and I think it is the leader's role to ensure that is absolutely crystal clear, and that it is compelling for the people who have chosen to follow the leader. And it starts with that purpose. Simon Sinek's idea, it starts with why. I think it does. It has. You need to have that. Now, the bit that I think that is also important for the leader is the small. It's actually, are we delivering on it? And that's getting into the details. It's really going super granular. So I think it's big picture and super granular. The key is to get out of the way in the middle and have nothing to do with the medium, right? I think that's really, really essential, but it's about making sure there's real clarity around what our desired result is, where we're heading, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what our purpose is and what our absolute singular, clear objective is. But to get out of the way in terms of the how is it to be done.
Yeah.
And I need to credit my wife for this, former CEO here. I remember her being promoted to CEO, having previously been in a commercial director role. And at the time I was coaching her. The baton's clearly been passed now because I get coached every day. But I remember asking her the question, what are you going to do differently in your role as CEO? And she gave me one of the best answers I've ever heard. She said, I'm going to be responsible for absolutely nothing, but I'm going to be available to everyone. And I think that great leaders actually achieve that, where they enable others to have the responsibility and to be for others to have that sense, not just sense, actual ability to make the difference and do the things, and to get out of their way and let them get on and do it with a clear picture of why they're doing it and where they fit in with that. But then to be available to support and to make things happen, whether that's external things happening or whether it's unlocking internal barriers or roadblocks that might come up around the way. I think that's the key piece, and I think that's what the best leaders do.
Yeah.
Is big picture and super granular. And the super granular can piss a few people off in an organisation when the leader drills down into things. But I think that's where you actually find whether or not you are on the right track to achieve that overall purpose. So big picture, super granular, get out the middle.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it just works as well, doesn't it? Because I think, if you're somebody who is in the middle, it's really empowering when the leader is out of the way.
Yeah.
But then it is also really helpful when you've got clarity at the top. And also, I think someone keeping you on your toes in the detail as well, a little bit. Like, you don't want to be, you want the ownership, but you want to be challenged, and that's, again, coming back to growth, that's kind of one of the ways in which you can grow, by being challenged. So
I've been very, very fortunate, Dan, to have been coached personally by a lot of amazing people, and one absolute standout for me is the time I spent with Stephen Covey, the author of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and one of the most influential people in my career. And I was very fortunate to have enrolled on his 7 Habits trainer program, and it was brought to his attention that there was a small group of people in Britain who weren't big corporates. They'd sort of moved into the corporate market, and I, along with a few others, were running smaller businesses. At the time, I was running a marketing agency. Anyway, he got interested. He came over to do sort of like one of his big gigs and what have you, and he asked to meet with us. There was about eight, 9 of us on this short program. We met with him 4 times, and he talked about so many different things, many of which are written up in his books. But he expanded the opportunity to actually ask someone about that and to expand on it. And I remember him repeating something which is document, which is, he said you cannot hold people responsible for their results if you supervise their methods. And I've always loved that idea of actually defining the desired result, being available to help if help is needed, but getting out the way to allow people to choose their own way of doing it. And it's not. And I remember sitting on a chairlift years ago. We used to take our whole company skiing every year. There's 70 of us. So not a big company, but not a tiny company either. And one thing about skiing, which is great, is that the mountains don't understand hierarchy, gender, socioeconomics, or anything else. The mountains are the mountains, right? So you find yourself in a chairlift with colleagues in the business who you don't necessarily interact with. I remember sitting with my then receptionist. By the way, today she's the managing director of my business, but then she was our receptionist, and we were chatting away. We got to know each other. But I also found myself with my non-exec director, and we were on this rattly old chairlift in Les Arcs, going up in an old two-person chair. He said, how's it going? I said, it's a lot, blah. And he gave me some great advice. He said, Peter, the thing is this, he said, if there's 10 decisions, he said, and they're all coming into you on your desk, he said, you are going to be a blocker. You're going to be a blocker to things that go on. He said, in my experience, he's a very, very successful individual. He said, in my experience, he said, 7 of the 10, right, they'll make the same decision that you would. He says, 2 of the 10, he said, they'll make a slightly different decision, but it'll have the same outcome. 1 will probably be a different decision and a different outcome. But that outcome might be a better one than the one that you would have had. You don't know. And his advice was basically, at the time, get out of the way. Don't have the 10 decisions sitting in your inbox or whatever, waiting for me to have time to address them. let the guys get on with them and deal with them. And that, I think, is another characteristic, is that preparedness to allow people not to fail. I think it's very profound. To allow people to do things differently,
Yeah.
and learn from them as a consequence. And I think that's part and parcel of it.
100%. Yeah. And it's that people always talk of failure in that negative sense, don't they? But then there is always something you can learn from a failure as well. So even if it isn't the right decision, it's what do you take from that and how do you evolve on that?
I think so, and I think also there's so many examples, aren't there, in life generally, where something was developed for one purpose and it may have failed in one area, but actually has succeeded hugely in another area. You look at various scientific developments, various products that have evolved as a consequence of the pursuit of things, and I think it's that continuous exploration. And if you are constantly, genuinely curious and wanting to explore new things, you're going to go down some cul-de-sacs. You're going to go down some wrong turns. You're going to waste some time. And people who, again, another Stephen Covey concept, people who are driven by efficiency more than effectiveness will hate that, because actually, I've just set up a meeting today just to brainstorm some new products with several members of the team. We've got a new marketing manager and she's absolutely ace. And I want to make sure that we get her fresh ideas before she becomes completely indoctrinated in our way of doing things. So we're going to have a meeting and it's a brainstorm of products. Now, if someone was doing a time and motion study, right, we set aside half a day for this, they might turn around and think, oh my God, that's a lot of time, and there's no fixed agenda, and there's no guaranteed output. There's not. And there might not be. It might be a waste of time. I don't think so. I think it's more, and even if it's just to enable a new relationship to nurture, from a good solid base, then that's worth it in itself. So, yeah. I don't like this idea of, you learn from every failure. No, you don't actually. Sometimes failures are bloody painful and you really wish you could avoid them. But I do feel that continuous exploration will yield more than a safe, steady as she goes approach.
Probably some of the biggest successes come out of the biggest risks in many ways as well, don't they? So
yeah, I think risk is an interesting thing, and that appetite for risk. And I think this goes back to the hunger piece, right? So I think as businesses get more successful, so they tend to become more protective, and they don't pursue new initiatives. It's no surprise to me that when you look at the new developments coming through in established areas, more often than not, it's small new entrants coming in who are upsetting the old guy. And it's funny because the trap is that new sort of entrant. You're in marketing. In the 80s there was a phase. It was called the third wave, and it was the third wave of advertising agencies that were coming through, and they were all quite radical, and they were challenging the sort of the norms of the two waves that occurred before. But they became the establishment themselves. And so suddenly there's a fourth wave or a fifth wave that comes in. So the trick, as I said, is to retain those two things, that appetite for exploration and improvement, and the humility that comes with saying, we don't know it all. And actually, it's really dangerous to believe that we do. We've got to take and adopt a position of, actually, we don't know. We don't know what's... I wonder how many large businesses are properly investigating applications of AI, for example, and how many small and nimble businesses are able to steal a march on them not through necessarily the development, but through the deployment of it.
Yeah, you mentioned there, AI is one big development and change that's coming in, and kind of how, as leaders, don't necessarily lose their hunger, but they become more risk averse. What do you think are the main sort of challenges that face leaders today in the current environment that we're in?
So there's the obvious technical challenges, but I think that as important and significant, maybe more so, are cultural.
Yeah.
And I think we are going through a cultural revolution that I think is as big as the technology revolution that they're experiencing as well. So, for example, my daughter is a lawyer. She works for a very major worldwide law firm, top 3, 4 law firm in the world. And she's been on maternity leave, and her employers have a very generous approach, and she was off for 20 months. She's now gone back to work. In that 20 months, she said, Dad, I can't tell you the changes that have taken place in terms of her role. From the perspective that where she was before, she does commercial litigation. So where she was before looking at quite technical, complex contracts and so on, AI is doing all of that. They've developed all of that. So the role is much more, it was always important, but it's become even more profoundly so about the relationships, client relationships, and also that imagining different outcomes, different possibilities and things, which at this point in time, AI has yet to master. But also the biggest thing was, that whole working from home environment. And so she goes back into the office, and she grew up, fortunately, I feel, still in an environment where the senior folk were coming to work most days, if not every day. So she was learning by osmosis. She'd just be dragged in there, go, Francesca, can you just be available for, and she would go into a meeting and sit in on a meeting purely from a learning perspective. Well, that is much more difficult to affect in the age of video conferencing and so on. You don't get that. So I think what we've got to deal with here, and I'm not just talking about the working from home piece, I'm talking about the AI piece as well. I'm old school, obviously. For me, I grew up in my education was pre-Google, pre-web, pre-anything. So we went to the library, and we'd go and get books, and then we'd read the books, and the books might send us down a rabbit hole. Again, sometimes without purpose, sometimes a waste of time, but often actually referencing something that really increased our learning and our education. And my concern is that everything being served up, oven ready, without any effort, my concern is, are we losing something from the learning piece? Are we learning that additional skill of being able to connect things that might otherwise not normally have been connected? So I think the big challenge for me with leadership right now is, yes, mastering the technology, yes, moving much, much more to an automated approach, automated first approach, but understanding that this has significant cultural factors. And how can the leader then make sure that culturally the leader the leadership team is retaining a culture of learning, improvement, development, progression, and growth. AI could cause an awful lot of average people to look quite good in the short term.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the best companies need people who can think, who are savvy, who can interpret things. I'm not sure that AI has got to that stage yet.
Yeah. And is it going to as well? I think that's a really interesting point. You kind of alluding to really that critical thinking skills that you develop in more academic study. I think, like you say, going to a library, or even with the internet pre-AI, where you had to go and search for answers to your questions. But it's really interesting because I've never thought of AI in that sense before, where I was kind of thinking, oh, it's great if I want a quick answer to a question, then it serves that up right in front of me. But it is just giving you that answer. And if that's a big problem that it's giving you an answer for, and might be the right answer in one scenario, and everyone then thinks you're great. But like you say, if it doesn't work, or you then got a different problem and AI hasn't got the answer and you've got to think about it,
completely.
Have people got the skill to do that?
Take that product development meeting that I mentioned earlier with our new head of marketing, right? So our managing director this morning, I copied her in on the fact we're having the meeting, inviting her if she wished to attend, but saying that you might do better just to allow Ailey, our new head of marketing, to be in that environment, and we'll just send you our summary and then get your contribution at that point, but your call. And she came back straight away and said, I've just put into ChatGPT this prompt with a whole lot of stuff, and it basically describes our business and what we do, and it's what products could we envisage developing, and it listed all of our products out, and what products could we be thinking about developing, and so on and so forth. Now the answer is phenomenal, and I'm really grateful on one hand to her for doing it, and it shows great initiative, and everything that I know of her, 20 years we've worked together, that's she's got on it straight away, come up with a solution. But the frustrating bit at the same time was looking at it thinking, is this now going to kill some critical? Are we closing off paths because there's already answers that have been delivered up to us, and of course I won't know the answer to that, right? And so I was always tempted to say, have you sent it to the others? And I saw that they had, because have they not? I said, don't send it to the others, because I want that clear thinking to be available, and then introduce perhaps that. So I think it's application and use and things, particularly when you're looking to be creative and when you're looking to develop new products and services and new initiatives. It's clever. It's brilliant. Going through a legal document like my daughter, she said it's better than I could have done, Dad. It's top class. But I just worry that we lose something that is special in terms of that whole development creative process.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that kind of annoys me about AI a lot, because quite often you'll see people posting about how it's going to replace creative disciplines first and foremost, like designers, music, content writers and stuff like that. And it's like, yeah, it can do that, but it's probably not going to do as good a job as a person, because actually it's very like retrospective in that it's learning from things in the past. But where's the creative thought about like how could you do things differently? And to your point about the ideas as well, it's like it's just looking at what's been done in the past. It's not got the people thinking and discussing what could we do differently to what happened in the past. So
I'm at risk here of either being a little bit cooler than people might imagine I'd be, or actually confirming that I'm definitely most not. But I take someone like James Hype, the DJ, right, as an example, and watch him mix music together, and I find him compelling to watch, and the way he brings. Now, could AI do that? Maybe, but can AI do it with the theatre that he brings to it, and the energy that he brings to it, and the way the crowd are responding to the music, but they're also responding to him standing behind the decks, doing this incredible performance. So I think that we've got a long way to go, and I feel optimistic about it. I think the key, therefore, for leadership is knowing when to deploy it and when not to, and and to understand also the dangers of it being applied too early in a process, particularly a creative process, but also the dangers of not applying or not using it for tasks which it is eminently more suitable for, more cost effective, quicker, better. Why wouldn't you? And I think for certainly my generation, even yours, Dan, as well, is there a danger that that we might not give it the attention that perhaps my stepson who's 21 and my stepdaughter who's 18, what their generation will give to it.
Yeah.
And so I think that for leaders, you don't necessarily, if you're running an organisation, be well versed in it yourself per se, but you need to make sure you've got some really great young people around you who are well versed in it and are able to contribute, in a way. And this is where, again, leadership is fantastic, because it's about the opportunity to actually accelerate through people in their careers based on different criteria that I think exists than in my early starts. What was necessary to get on in my early career is not the same as today, but there are certain principles, as Stephen Covey put it, which will remain timeless, and for me, therefore, back to this leadership point, and with AI is a tool, right? It is a tool. And it's using it wisely and appropriately is absolutely there, but also the human element, I think, is still very, very important today.
100%. You mentioned some interesting things as well there. I thought you were talking about the kind of different generations of people, and kind of one of the big challenges being like cultural. On some of our recent podcasts, we've been talking about office spaces and how people create great office spaces. And one of the interesting points there was how an office, and therefore a business and a leader as well, all now cater for so many different generations of people. And I hate to talk about stereotypical generations because I hate it when people call me a millennial, but you've got from boomer to Gen Z, and I learned there's alpha, and there's even my son, who's 6 months old, is a Gen Beta or something now as well. I only learned that yesterday. But as a leader in a business, that is quite a diversity of people that you might be leading with very different motivations, objectives, desires, however you want to call it. But so how would you advise leaders deal with that in today?
Well, I think it's always been there. So back to principles. If I look at my life, I've got my stepfather's 97. My mum's not far behind him. Then there's me and my brothers, and I'm a boomer. There are certain criteria that might just get me into Gen X, but no, reality is I'm a boomer. So you've got civics as one label for my parents' generation is concerned. Then you've got boomers, and then you've got Gen X. And I'm growing up with, I'm married to a Gen X. My daughter is a millennial, and my stepchildren are Gen Z. So, and I've got a grandson who's 20 months old, so just a little bit ahead of your child. So, and that was true for many, that's gone on. So we've always had to deal with different generations. And, to quote Mike Rutherford, every generation blames the one before, right? So what great leaders, I think, do is learn the lessons from their predecessors as to how to manage it. And there are plenty of examples of leaders in all fields of life who are of completely different generational makeup, but are still able to attract followers. And this is the key bit, back to this attracting followers. You do not want to just be attracting, carbon copies of yourself as followers, because that's massively limiting. You want to be able to attract diverse mix of people, but all of whom operate on a common cause, a common purpose, with a common agreed set of values. I think values, I do away with that now. I prefer to think of them as behaviours. And I think that the behaviours come out of values. So what are our core behaviours that we absolutely have within our organisation that everybody the guides how we do things. So I think if you've got the clarity around that, so if you've got your purpose, if you've got and by the way, your purpose might just be to make a shed load of money, and if that's the case, then you'll attract certain types of followers. You might have a bigger purpose than that. We certainly do in our organisation. But we also have. I mentioned the post model, which earlier, our purpose, which is the P, is to inspire people to fulfil their potential, right? Our objective, the O, is very clear, right? We want to have 1,000 members in our business by and that leads to a financial metric in terms of it. Then the S stands for strategy, singular. What's our singular strategy? Our singular strategy is what we call birds of a feather. So we connect, we do learning with leaders and business owners from the same sectors, but they don't compete. So we make sure that's our strategy is to, and tactics is the only plural. That's the T. Tactics, you have thousands of them. Now, Alistair Campbell, I must credit for this model. In his book Winning, he had the OST. I'm not making any political observation, but there was no mention of any purpose. Campbell's objective with Blair was to win the general election. Dead simple, right? The strategy, New Labour, New Britain, New Britain, New Labour, whichever way around it was. Dead simple, right? Dead simple clarity. Tactics, thousands of them, right? Now, again, I'm not making any political commentary. You look at Trump, right? Really simple objective to get elected, right? His strategy, MAGA, make America great again. Can you tell me what Hillary Clinton's strategy? I know her objective was she wanted to win she wanted to win as well. Her objective was the same. What was her strategy? Right? You look at Boris in terms of his objective, win the general. Well, his strategy, get Brexit done. Dead simple, right? Can you tell me what Corbyn's strategy was? And this, I think, is a great illustration. We've added purpose to make it the post model, and I think that should be there. And I think, by the way, in the case of all of those politicians, I do think that they have a purpose. I think that their purpose is that they wish to create a better society, and we can debate whether they're right in their approach to that or not. But I think that they all genuinely believe that their way could be purposeful in terms of creating a better society, but and then they've got that objective strategy tactics. I think that what business leaders need to do is to define those things. What's our purpose and what is our singular objective? And the purpose, by the way, is probably unlikely to ever be accomplished in the lifetime of one leader. Mm-hmm. But the objective will change, and you know, once elected, what's the next objective? And it's singular strategy, singular tactics, thousands, if you wish, as many as you wish.
I love that model because I've never heard it as a model like that before. But then I think to some of the great businesses that I've worked for, I know of, and I can quite quickly think what their purpose is and what their objective is. And I think that's the most important bit, because you can then define your strategy and tactics after that. But
Campbell makes the point about his political opposition at the time in his book, that a lot of organisations confuse tactics and strategy. And they think that they've got a strategy when actually it's a tactic. Getting clarity around that singular strategy is really important part of that process. And then allowing people to go away and come up with tactics to underpin it is there. So the most common thing that I observe is either a purpose which is total and utter BS. You know, there's a declaration of something, but actually the reality is the leadership just want to make money, right? And by the way, if that's the case, then fine. I have no problem with that. You know, if our purpose is to generate X million billion of business value, so fine. Doesn't float my boat, but it might float other people's. The problem is, though, that a lot of people don't actually have a strategy. What they have is a load of tactics, and that is different.
But I think to your point as well, though, it doesn't really necessarily matter what the purpose and the objective are of the business, as long as they are things that can attract those followers. Then you're a good leader, aren't you? So
I think so. And it's, you know, leadership in all walks of life, you know, the only commonality is that they have followers. You know, they're successful, they have followers, regardless of whether their cause is even appropriate or not. You know, so I think it's about having that ability to attract, retain, and then of course align and enable, empower if you like, but enable those followers to do their best work towards that common objective, towards that common purpose.
Amazing. I love that. And we've naturally come full circle to the beginning where you defined what a leader was as somebody that has followers. So it feels like a good place for us to wrap up. That there's many other tangents I think we could go off there. But the final thing I wanted to ask you about today was, as we spoke about earlier, we now have created this On the Up book club. You referenced a couple of great books there throughout the discussion as well. But I'd love to get your recommendations on some of the books you recommend people go away and read.
This is a really challenging question for me, Dan, because I'm a serial reader. It sounds rather grand, doesn't it, to call it a library? But I've got over 3,000 books there. There's books everywhere, right? My life.
I think I've seen your library on a call before, actually. It was quite impressive.
Well, it's, you know, there's a lot in there. And so where do you start? Okay. So I often say to people, the absolute starting point, if someone's in a new to leadership role, or indeed new to business role, is Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But a second book that is not as well known that Stephen wrote is called Principle Centered Leadership. And it's really the 7 habits applied to an organisation. So it's taking up another level from personal to organisational level. And you kindly, before, when I asked you if I could have 2 books as opposed to one, indulge me with that. So again, I've referenced Jim Collins, and of course Jim Collins is best known for Good to Great. But the book that actually I think was the most significant for me that he wrote was called Beyond Entrepreneurship. Now, he's just updated it and written a follow-up called BE 2.0, Beyond Entrepreneurship 2.0, which is a good read, but I would be tempted to start with the original, and in particular, the first third of it. I think anybody in a startup who's looking to get into a scale-up, which is one of the most difficult challenges for leaders, startup it's not easy. Scale-up, I think, is even harder. And beyond entrepreneurship, this idea of moving from an entrepreneurial type environment into a medium-sized environment, that I think is a really good read.
Amazing. I love those recommendations as well from like authors that I think most people will have heard of 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, but to find a nugget of another book written by some of those great authors would be really interesting for people to go away and read. So
I've got another 2,998 that I can suggest, but time wasn't allowed
maybe
to
we'll
do
do
that.
another podcast of Peter's book recommendations. But no, they sound amazing. It's been really great discussion. Loads of interesting points for people to go away and digest, and sparked lots of questions, I think, hopefully for people as well. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you, and I hope people enjoy listening to us as well.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the On the Up podcast, brought to you from Moneypenny. Stay tuned for our next episode coming soon.